A private aircraft sat waiting on a West Virginia runway on the morning of the 6th of February 2019, fueled and ready for a short hop to a financial institution in Lynchburg, Virginia. Strapped in, or supposed to be, was 38-year-old Michael Cochran, a father of two, who thought he was finally about to witness proof of something he'd waited years for: verification that the government contracting empire his wife described actually existed. That flight got scrapped within hours. His own wife phoned the pilot and killed the trip before dawn had fully broken. Before the sun set that same day, Michael was sprawled unconscious across his kitchen tile. 5 days later, on February 11th, he was gone. Unraveling what actually occurred would consume federal investigators, expose a $2.5 million investment fraud, force the exhumation of a corpse, and require a forensic pathologist to stake his professional reputation on the word homicide before Michael's family finally got their answer, 6 agonizing years after his death. This isn't merely a homicide investigation. This is an account of a man who devoted 19 years of his existence to a partnership built entirely on fabrication, and by the conclusion of this story, the sheer depth of deception his wife orchestrated will leave you stunned. Michael Brandon Cochran entered the world on the 23rd of December 1980 in Beckley, West Virginia, son of Michael Edward Cochran and Donna Bolt. His childhood unfolded in Raleigh County, deep within Appalachian coal country, a tight-knit region where your name and standing followed you everywhere. Functionally an only child, he gained a stepfather, Ed Bolt, around age 8, and the pair grew close for the remainder of Michael's life. Athletics consumed his youth. Baseball, basketball, football, he played them all. He picked up his first barbell set around 10 or 11 years old, and by high school, he claimed first place in a powerlifting contest. This physical dedication wasn't incidental. It would resurface years later as a critical piece of courtroom strategy during his own murder trial. At 17, Michael crossed paths with Natalie Jessup. The story goes that they met at a sporting goods retailer where she worked the counter. Both later attended West Virginia University, Michael pursuing information technology, Natalie studying pharmacy. Their freshman year, November 1999, they got engaged. By May 2000, they were married. The newlyweds put down roots in Daniels, West Virginia, and constructed a life that, from any outside vantage point, appeared textbook, stable, and thriving. Michael built a career in IT, specializing in cable and coaxial infrastructure. Natalie earned her pharmacy license, a credential that granted her automatic respect and trust throughout their community. 2 children followed, a daughter, Nicole, and a son, Ashton. But according to everyone who genuinely knew him, Michael's real identity wasn't his profession. It was fatherhood and coaching kids. He led football and baseball teams, the type of coach parents specifically hoped would show up engaged and reliable, not only for his own kids, but for every child on the roster. One family friend recounted how, after a local boy lost his father, Michael quietly filled that void, taking him fishing, driving him to practice, becoming the steady adult male figure that child had lost. This was Michael Cochran before any of the chaos. A devoted husband, father, and mentor. For 17 years, that description was simply his reality. Not a hint suggested catastrophe was on the horizon. Then 2017 arrived, and everything shifted. That year, Michael and Natalie attached themselves to a fresh venture called Tactical Solutions Group, or TSG for short. According to its own marketing and website, TSG positioned itself as a legitimate defense contractor, claiming ties directly to the U.S. Department of Defense. A companion company, Technology Management Solutions, ran in tandem Natalie abandoned her pharmacy career entirely to steer the business, taking majority ownership while Michael retained a smaller stake. To family and neighbors watching from outside, it read as an inspiring pivot, their trusted community pharmacist reinventing herself as a government contracting entrepreneur. What no one grasped yet, according to later investigation, was that Tactical Solutions Group had secured exactly 0 federal or state contracts. Technology Management Solutions had landed 2 state deals, but West Virginia terminated both after repeated missed deadlines. The entire defense contractor facade rested on essentially nothing. Yet Natalie sold the narrative flawlessly, telling loved ones the business model mirrored the film War Dogs, young operators exploiting gaps in military procurement to build fortunes for people who trusted this couple for decades. It sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. So they wrote checks. Natalie convinced at least 11 separate individuals to funnel a combined $2.5 million into the operation. To reinforce the illusion, prosecutors later allege she stole personal identifying data from real government and banking professionals, then crafted investor emails designed to look like official correspondence from those legitimate sources. This wasn't casual lying, it was a manufactured evidentiary trail. And the lifestyle that emerged reinforced the con perfectly. The Cochrans amassed 3 properties: motorcycles, a vintage 1,965 Shelby Cobra, and vacations spanning Paris and Hawaii. On a $100,000 loan application, the couple reportedly listed business assets north of $500,000. Before the larger scheme surfaced publicly, a smaller red flag went largely unnoticed. Natalie had handled treasurer duties for a youth baseball league, and after a fundraiser, members grew suspicious that funds had vanished. A private investigator, James Quessenberry, traced league money to purchases at retailers like T.J. Maxx and restaurants like Olive Garden. No criminal charges ever materialized from that incident, but suspicion had already taken root. And here's a crucial detail for understanding everything that follows. Former investigators maintained that Michael himself had no idea the business was fraudulent. He helped scout potential contracts to bid on, but that, according to sworn testimony, represented the outer limit of his involvement. The same fabrications Natalie was selling to outside investors, she was simultaneously selling to her own husband. By 2018, sliding into early 2019, the structure was starting to buckle. Investors who'd sunk their savings or retirement accounts into the venture started demanding returns. Michael joined that chorus. Text messages later, pulled by investigators, revealed Michael growing suspicious of inconsistencies, specifically the mismatch between what investors claimed they'd contributed and what Natalie had actually disclosed to him. He wasn't interrogating from the outside looking in. He was questioning as a genuine partner who fully believed the enterprise was legitimate and the money was real, simply delayed. Natalie's fix, prosecutors would later argue, was orchestrating a trip. The plan called for Michael and Natalie to fly into Lynchburg, Virginia, sit down with bank officials, and finally unlock the funds tied to those supposed defense contracts. A pilot was hired. According to Christopher Davis, a close friend who later testified, Michael was practically buzzing with anticipation, convinced this was finally the day everything would be verified and vindicated. That flight was set for the morning of the 6th of February 2019. That same morning, Natalie contacted the pilot directly and canceled everything. While that scheduled trip was quietly dissolving, something far darker was unfolding inside the Cochran residence, a sequence of events that would take years to fully reconstruct. Neighbor Jennifer Davis later testified that Natalie had complained of feeling unwell and claimed she needed insulin. Davis assembled a supply and sent it over with her husband on his way to work that morning, with Natalie insisting the medication was for her own use. At 12:21 that afternoon, Natalie texted contractor Jason Bowen, urging him to come over because Michael had fallen ill. When Bowen showed up, he discovered Michael collapsed on the kitchen floor. Natalie asked for help getting him onto the couch. Bowen would later testify that Michael showed zero response to verbal stimulation and even a sternum rub, a hard knuckle grind against the chest bone designed to jolt an unconscious person awake through pain, produced absolutely nothing. Shortly after receiving that insulin delivery, Natalie reportedly texted Jennifer Davis a photograph showing Michael motionless on the kitchen floor, an image Davis later described as deeply alarming. More visitors arrived throughout the day. Stephanie Hamilton, a physician assistant and close friend of the family, found Michael entirely unresponsive and urged Natalie to get him professional medical evaluation immediately, even offering to accompany her. According to Hamilton's later account, Natalie brushed it off, insisting Michael simply needed to sleep it off. Christopher Davis, the same friend connected to the aborted Lynchburg flight, arrived and found Michael on the couch, unresponsive to everything happening around him. He pushed hard for hospital transport. Multiple witnesses had now seen Michael unconscious. Multiple people had explicitly urged emergency intervention. And still, hours slipped by before Michael finally reached a hospital. When he arrived, his blood glucose registered at 21. For context, that number isn't simply dangerous. It borders on lethal territory entirely on its own. A physician assistant familiar with the case put it bluntly: nobody should ever have a blood sugar reading of 21. That's a coma-level emergency, a fight for survival. By the time medical staff got hands on him, catastrophic damage was already locked in. He developed cerebral edema, severe brain swelling triggered by the sustained extreme collapse in blood sugar. He never regained awareness. Michael was moved into hospice. There would be no turning back. The swelling had progressed too far. The window for saving him had closed long before anyone got him real medical attention. On the 11th of February 2019, Michael Brandon Cochran died at age 38. To the outside world and to almost everyone beyond the investigative circle, this registered as a devastating but purely medical tragedy. A fit, active husband, father, and coach struck down by an inexplicable blood sugar crash. Grief poured in. His obituary celebrated a man who cherished life and youth athletics. In lieu of flowers, the family requested donations to Shady Spring Middle School's baseball program, a fitting send-off honoring the sport that shaped his entire existence. At that moment, not a single person was calling this murder. In the months following Michael's death, the parallel financial investigation into Natalie's business kept gaining momentum. Investors still waiting on promised returns kept escalating their complaints, and eventually those grievances landed on federal desks. In June 2019, investigators executed a search warrant on the Cochran home, targeting evidence tied strictly to the fraud case. During that search, they discovered insulin. At the time, that discovery didn't immediately trigger a re-examination of Michael's death, but it got documented, it got filed away, and it would resurface. By September 2019, Natalie faced formal federal indictment on charges spanning wire fraud, bankruptcy fraud, and money laundering. The full scope of her operation came into focus. A scheme running from roughly June 2017 through August 2019, extracting approximately $2.5 million from at least 11 victims for contracts that federal prosecutors determined were either wildly inflated or entirely fictional. Retired West Virginia State Trooper Timothy Bledsoe later delivered particularly chilling testimony confirming that Natalie continued actively recruiting new investors for her phony defense contracting business even after Michael had died. The fraud hadn't paused for her husband's funeral. It simply kept running. In 2020, Natalie entered a guilty plea to wire fraud and money laundering charges. Under the plea deal, she agreed to pay close to $2.6 million in restitution and surrender assets, including 2 properties, the 1,965 Shelby Cobra, several additional vehicles, jewelry, and roughly $45,000 pulled from a business account. In March 2021, she received a sentence of 135 months in federal prison, exceeding 11 years, alongside orders to repay over $2.5 million. To the public, watching from outside, this appeared to be the closing chapter. A pharmacist turned con artist finally caught, convicted, and sentenced. But investigators hadn't abandoned that insulin discovered 2 years prior inside the Cochran home. And in November 2021, while Natalie sat behind bars serving her fraud sentence, she was hit with a dramatically graver charge: first-degree murder in the death of her own husband, Michael Cochran. The murder prosecution crawled through the legal system, slowed by exhumation logistics, extensive forensic re-examination, and a barrage of pre-trial motions. Michael's remains had to be exhumed 7 months after his initial burial to allow for a fresh autopsy. Medical examiner Dr. Pyotr Kubitschek performed that exhumation examination and testified he couldn't pinpoint a definitive cause of death. 7 months of decomposition had eliminated any chance of identifying needle marks or confirming insulin presence directly within the tissue. That inconclusive finding became a cornerstone of the defense strategy once the trial finally commenced in January 2025, held in Raleigh County Circuit Court. Prosecutors Tom Truman and Ashley Ackward constructed their argument around one central theory. Natalie eliminated Michael because he was inching too close to exposing her Ponzi scheme, and the abruptly canceled Lynchburg flight represented the tipping point. Had Michael actually reached that bank and discovered no funds waiting, the entire fraudulent operation, along with Natalie's freedom, would have unraveled instantly. Medical testimony became the primary battleground inside the courtroom. Endocrinologist Dr. Diane Krieger testified that brain swelling had already commenced by the time Michael reached the hospital, and asserted that insulin administration was, in her expert opinion, the sole medically plausible explanation. Forensic pathologist Dr. Paul Uribe pushed further still, describing Michael's blood glucose reading of 21 as, in his own words, profound, and concluding definitively that Michael had received insulin and that his death qualified as homicide. Uribe conceded there was no direct physical proof of insulin recovered from Michael's remains, since the exhumation happened years after death destroyed that possibility, but he insisted no alternative medical explanation could account for such a severe, sustained hypoglycemic crisis in an otherwise healthy man with no diabetes history. FBI forensic examiner Earl Gleam testified regarding an insulin vial recovered from the Cochran residence, noting its rubber seal appeared to have been punctured. A separate FBI chemist confirmed 2 of 3 liquid containers pulled from the home matched their labeled contents, insulin and a steroid, while the third contained something entirely different from what its label claimed. Investigators further exposed how Natalie had delivered contradictory accounts of that day's events. In one telling, she claimed she and Michael were sitting together when he wandered into the kitchen, collapsed, and struck his head against the counter. In a separate version offered just 1 day later, she claimed Michael had been sleeping on the couch before later walking into the kitchen and collapsing there. She additionally claimed Michael had been self-injecting insulin into his back. Prosecutors framed these inconsistent narratives as clear evidence of guilty knowledge. The defense team, headed by attorneys Matthew Victor and Stanley Selden, didn't dispute the financial crimes outright. Their position centered on separating fraud from murder, conceding Natalie may have been, in their phrasing, dishonest financially, but insisting dishonesty didn't equate to homicide. They leaned heavily on Michael's relationship with bodybuilding and supplements. Natalie's own daughter, Nicole, testified that her father was fixated on his physique and consumed massive quantities of supplements daily, describing pills arranged on the kitchen counter in a circle roughly the size of a dinner plate. Both children testified regarding alleged steroid use, including claims involving oral steroids sourced from Mexico and anabolic injections. The defense's implication was straightforward. Perhaps Michael's death stemmed from supplement misuse or an unrelated underlying condition entirely disconnected from Natalie's actions. The jury rejected that theory outright. On the 29th of January, 2025, jurors returned a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. Deliberation lasted under 2 hours, a strikingly brief window that both prosecution and Michael's family read as confirmation of just how overwhelming the state's evidence had been. The subsequent phase would decide whether Natalie retained any future possibility of parole. Under West Virginia law, a first-degree murder conviction permits juries to recommend mercy, which opens a path to eventual parole eligibility, or deny it entirely, locking in life without any chance of release. That mercy phase fractured the family down the middle. Natalie's mother, Daphne Jessup, appealed directly to jurors, arguing that Natalie's children needed their mother present and that she and her husband, Larry, might not survive long enough to see Natalie again should mercy be refused. Natalie's daughter, Nicole, described her mother as her closest friend, expressing a wish to have her present for future milestones, including birthdays and the eventual births of her own children. Natalie's son similarly appealed for mercy, reminding jurors their decision would reshape the remainder of the children's lives, not solely their mother's fate. Jurors began mercy deliberations at 3:53 that afternoon and returned at 5:18 with their verdict, no mercy granted. Natalie Cochran received a sentence of life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. Her legal team subsequently filed motions pursuing acquittal or a fresh trial, contending the case warranted a change of venue and that certain evidence never should have reached the jury. Judge H.L. Kirkpatrick rejected those motions outright, ruling that the jury had conducted itself fairly at every stage. Michael Cochran spent 19 years placing his complete trust in the one person who was closest to him, right up until the day that trust ultimately cost him his life.